Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar hosted by Adatis and Microsoft. Today our speakers are going to be going over how you can leverage the power of ChatGPT and OpenAI to deliver real-world value for your organization. So our speakers for today, we have Deborah Shakespeare from Microsoft, who is the UK lead for Azure Data and AI, so an expert in her field. And we also have our very own Matt Howe, who is our head of data science at Adatis and leads our AI practice. Now, before I pass on to Deborah, I just want to do a quick housekeeping. As you can see, the session is recorded. But if you do have any questions throughout the session, please use the chat function and we will try and answer them at the end. The recording will also be shared out on email after the session's ended as well. Okay, so without further ado, we can just kick off. So I'll pass it on to Deb.
Thank you. So I don't think I need to tell everybody that there's been so much turbulence and change over the last couple of years. It has triggered so many other changes for us as well. Industries, regardless of which sector you're in, they're really transforming very rapidly. The drivers for economic growth are constantly evolving. And the world is so much more connected than ever before as well. Next slide, please. And market expectations, as you can see, are really changing as well. One of the things that we've already seen is the swift pace of change of technology. It comes a real sort of change in expectations from our customers, our partners, employees and the market. And we've even noticed as well, a lot of the younger generation, 11-year-olds, even younger, are using ChatGPT. AI has become the focus for numerous organisations across sizes, segments, and a lot of results, real results, already being realised as well, even from some of the most recent changes. And some of those changes, we've seen the headlines. It's been absolutely phenomenal for us at Microsoft. Working at Microsoft even, it's hard to keep up with all the changes. The partnership with OpenAI meant that the Azure OpenAI service became generally available back in January. That then very quickly followed by sort of all the announcements in February, which included Teams Premium. And then we had the new Bing and Edge. Then we introduced some of the co-pilots. And 2 weeks ago, if anybody was watching at Build, we made 50 new announcements, and many of those were AI based. And I'm still catching up on all of those announcements. And even this week, we made some more announcements as well. So it really is a rapid evolution of this technology and actually getting it into the hands of our users and our customers as well, which is phenomenal. To take advantage of all of this, though, having a scalable and a trustworthy cloud provider is key. If you're not already a Microsoft Cloud customer, then hopefully you'll talk to us about our cloud presence. We have a global presence. It's in hundreds of regions globally. We've got the largest GPUs underpinning AI. We've got integrated security solutions. Our applications are infused with AI, as well as having the tools to build the applications that'll help you get that differentiation out in the market for your business rather than your competition. I mentioned that we started to introduce co-pilots. For those that aren't familiar with all of them, the co-pilots that we've actually introduced so far have been for 365. So it's working alongside you in the apps that you would use every day, whether it's Windows, whether it's Office. Then there's the Dynamics 365 co-pilot, which is really helping the workforce having the day-to-day tasks and every sort of job role. That'll really sort of accelerate their productivity. There's co-pilots in Power Platforms, and then you've got Security Copilot that's been announced in GitHub. And you may not know that actually the GitHub Copilot was actually launched back in last summer. It went under the radar as AI, shall we say, but it was launched last summer. Developers love it. We've got, I think at the last count, it's something like over 50% of the code is now generated by Copilot. It's working with developers, it's not replacing them, but it is doing the stuff that maybe developers aren't so keen on doing, which is writing test scripts and documentation, as well as accelerating their own code development. We also introduced a new Copilot stack as well, that was announced at Build. And the whole idea of the Copilot stack is that that'll enable you to actually accelerate your development for your own Copilots. And again, we've already started to see some of our customers developing their own very industry, very specific Copilots for their own internal use. So that's based on the Copilot stack. When we talk about Azure AI, it does, though, mean that there are actually other things other than the Azure OpenAI service. Azure AI has been around for quite a long time now. It's been evolving across multiple services. There are 4 key categories of AI capabilities. There's the machine learning technology, cognitive services, so transcription, sound, pictures, and then you've got the infrastructure as well as sort of the Azure OpenAI service. And the way that I like to think about OpenAI service is it's like the icing on the cake of all the other cognitive services, because you can get a huge amount of value from all these services. The real benefit, though, is when you start to combine them together. And that's when you can then infuse your own apps. So that's where the application innovation platform, the developer platform, comes into its own as well. And just to sort of level set, if you weren't aware of what has happened with our relationship with OpenAI, it is a massive partnership for us. So our CEO, Satya Nadella, had the foresight a few years ago to actually Microsoft invested in OpenAI as an organization. We then made another investment at the back end of last year. And what that means is that actually they are using Microsoft Azure. So OpenAI as a technology, when you use ChatGPT and all the other services they have, that is actually running in Azure. So it's running the dials and it's using all the GPUs that we've got in Azure. What it also means, though, as part of the partnership, is we actually are able to take all of those large language models and actually create them as an Azure service. So effectively, there is Azure OpenAI. And then the Azure OpenAI has the same capabilities as OpenAI, ChatGPT, Codex, which is what's underpinning Copilot for GitHub, and DALL-E as well for pictures. The key thing, though, that a lot of people are clearly very nervous about is data privacy. And when you actually take Azure OpenAI, it actually runs in Azure subscriptions. So therefore, your data is your data. It's stored, it's encrypted, it's within your world, it's not our data. We do not use any customer data for fine tuning. It's not used to train the foundational models. It's purely seen as another Azure service within your own subscription. And the really great thing about this as well is you can treat it, it's the same as any other Azure service. So from a control point of view, you can use your role-based access control. You can encrypt it with managed keys. You can do whatever else you need to do with it. And when it's in your subscription, you infuse it effectively, you train it on your data. And that also is a real critical thing for how you then take this wonderful generic service and actually make it your own. There is another dimension as well, though, to everything we're talking about today, and obviously it's been in the press a lot around AI, and that's about the responsible side and the ethical side as well. We started building our principles and frameworks back in 2018. It's not new for us because we have all these other cognitive services as well. So AI, again, generally has not been a new thing. We have been evolving it though, and we have now got a lot of documentation, the frameworks, tooling, and there is a brand new tool as well that was introduced at Build called the AI Content Safety Tool. That was one of the 50 announcements, and it's all to support this area, and all of this is available as well. So whether it's documentations, best practice frameworks, and the tooling as well, you can have access to all of these capabilities to go alongside actually implementing the technology. So what do people typically use it for? What have we seen since the advent of Azure OpenAI and all the other services? They fall into four main buckets of use cases that we typically see. Content generation. And that's certainly where one of the co-pilots has gone as well, with content generating as part of an email that maybe you want to send. But a lot of it is about potentially marketing content or internal content. There is a case study on our website by CarMax. They've used it for more of a content generation because it's part of their content generation for their website. Then you have summarization. There is a very, very large telco that adopted this in the early days, and they're using it now to do alongside the other cognitive services as well. So doing the core summarization, doing the so it's multiple stages: transcription, summarization, looking for sentiment. So that is a really common one if you have large call centers or lots of calls coming in, or even now lots of people are using that summarization model from an email point of view as well, how to route emails. Code generation we talked about. What we're also finding is it's not just developers that are picking up on this code generation piece using Codex, but we've also started to find a lot of data scientists as well, and data engineers, and even infrastructure engineers. So actually helping generate Scala, Python, anything else that is needed from a code generation point of view. And then the other one is the semantic search. So maybe you're actually searching reviews for a specific product or service. Again, CarMax did something similar with a semantic search. They were looking for summarization of reviews. So rather than actually having to read 20 different reviews or 100 different reviews, what's the summarization of that? What's the search capability that you can do? And then the discovery and the knowledge mining. I've talked about a couple of sectors, telco and I suppose CarMax, which is a bit more retail-like. The couple other ones that we're starting to see is a lot of regulated industries are looking at combining some of these together. And the one that's really hot for a lot of regulated industries at the moment is that documentation, semantic search and summarization, especially if they have a lot of regulation documents that they have to adhere to, and they want to provide their own internal staff with actual good prompts and useful information or advice if the person on the internally is actually advising their customers maybe on funds or safety and things like that. So those are the ones that we're starting to see bubble up at the moment. But at that point, I'm going to hand over to Matt.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Deb. That's really interesting stuff there. So whilst that kind of shows some of the Microsoft perspective on these technologies and what they're doing on their side to kind of ensure things like responsible AI and other things, I want to talk a little bit about how you can actually get into the nuts and bolts of adopting Azure OpenAI within your integration, within your organization. And as anyone will know, there's a number of different things to consider when looking at adopting any new technology piece into an organization. So I'm going to kind of touch on kind of three key themes in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes or so. The first of that is going to be how you review and analyze your use cases internally to make sure that they're suitable for Azure OpenAI and you're going to get the most out of those services. The next one is then talk a little bit about integration, how you start thinking about integrating those services into either existing existing AI applications or other services you might be already running. And then a really critical piece is monitoring that and staying on top of those services and making sure that they're continuing to deliver the value that was expected or was seen initially. So starting with the use cases, what we find is that there are some use cases that are really sit well in the kind of the sphere for Azure OpenAI. And these are similar to the things that Deb's just kind of touched on here. Things like text summarization, content generation, language translation, etc. All really strong use cases for OpenAI. But there are some things that customers come to us with the kind of assumption that they might fit for OpenAI, but actually they're not so good. So you almost do want to think about these two things, that there are things that might not be suitable for these large language models. Some of these things include things like deep domain knowledge. So whilst the models are trained on a lot of data from the internet, they're not going to have specific, healthcare information or information about specific products that may be within your organization. So bearing in mind they have a great level of general knowledge, but maybe not a really, really deep, specific knowledge in certain domains is a really important thing to remember. The completions and the outputs of these models also sometimes take a couple of seconds to generate. So if you're trying to hook up a website, for example, that needs sub-second responses from a model about a sentiment classification, then a large language model may not be the right approach to deliver that low level of latency. Just to touch on a few more here. So things like numeric analysis are sometimes problematic for large language models. So asking it to kind of understand and summarize numbers and perform numerical operations on those numbers can sometimes lead to some inconsistencies and incorrect answers. So you have to really be making sure that you're validating the responses coming back from those models when looking at doing more kind of analytical or statistical analysis with those. And of course, the other thing is that these models were trained on data that was available in 2021. So there is a slight training data latency. So if you need to tell your model certain context, it's important that you put that into things like the prompt and the information you're feeding your model. As for example, if you ask the models now who the Prime Minister of the UK is, currently it thinks it's still Boris Johnson because those models have not been uptrained with the latest set of data. So just thinking about how your use cases fit into those two categories is really important. So coming down to the actual endpoints that we have open to ourselves as organizations. So the first one to talk about is the completions API. So this is an API that allows us to generate a completed response to a given prompt. So essentially a user provides an input, for example, summarize the following text, and provides a description of what machine learning might be. The API then consumes that prompt and then returns a response from the large language model. And this is a very simplistic input-output way of working. The next one is the chat completions API, which most people will associate with ChatGPT and also more recently the GPT-4 models. With this, you can now start to do a little bit more. There's a bit more flexibility. For example, you can set a system message. So using this, you can almost set your chatbot to have a persona. For example, if your company has a certain way of dealing with things and wants to impersonate that through their chatbot, you can start to set those kind of configurations using a system message. For example, in this, I've chosen to give my chatbot a sassy attitude. But you could also ask them to be light and comical, or always take a very formal and kind of corporate tone, for example. You can also set some boundaries in here. For example, if you don't know the answer, make sure you say that you don't know. It's really important to make sure that you're not kind of tasking your chatbot to kind of expand on things that they're not sure about. But primarily, you set this system message, a user provides an input, and similarly, you get a response that forms much more like a chat with a real person as opposed to just a block of text as you might get with the completions API. And the final one is the embeddings API. And this is less kind of human readable, but for machine learning models that want to consume text data, embeddings are a much more efficient way of doing that. This is a really kind of quite specific use case, but if you're looking to use text data in subsequent machine learning models or search systems, then creating these embeddings, which is like a numerical representation of text, is a very, very useful and efficient way of doing that to get some really, really effective results. So just some further considerations when to think about when looking at your OpenAI use cases. So of course, one of the key things is the ethical considerations. So Deb's touched on the responsible AI, but it's also, it's really important that you as an organization think about the ethical considerations that might be in play when you're implementing an OpenAI solution. So particularly if there's going to be any decisions relating to individuals or any advice given by that particular chatbot or completions endpoint, the ethical considerations of that are really paramount. A common question that comes up is about role replacement and how do we set boundaries on this system to ensure that we're not going to, remove the need for certain staff members or certain roles in a particular industry. A common kind of example of this, for example, is DALL-E, which can generate images based on prompts, which can obviously speed up the work of a graphic designer by many, many times. So it's all about making sure that the technology is embraced and is available, but also there are boundaries to make sure that we're not pushing people out that may have critical roles and creativity on top of that. Of course, there's a job to maintain responsible AI going forwards and making sure that whilst Microsoft make a commitment to responsible AI, but the organizations that are also using that technology are living and breathing that same pledge. Then we have to think about the opportunity cost. If we didn't do this particular use case and focus on something else, what might be the cost of not doing that? What are we going to miss out on if we're not taking on that particular opportunity? And also, how do we factor in data specifics? How do we factor in our own data? If this chatbot is going to be answering queries about HR concerns, how do we make sure that it's got our HR policies to hand? So thinking about what data may be additional to your chatbot is really important, and making sure that's available. So now to talk a little bit more about how we actually integrate with these services. And here's a little bit of sort of a history lesson about how we arrived at the kind of the particular format that's been chosen for integrating these services. So as Deb mentioned, there are these cognitive services that live within Microsoft Azure, and these have been around for several years now and have been incrementally getting more and more powerful and more kind of nuanced in the way that they tackle different AI problems. But the fundamental underpinning benefit and the reason why these have been so prolific is because of the very, very simple input-output structure of these API calls. It means that developers can very, very quickly format a kind of a request to the API, pass that off, very quickly get a response they know is trained on a production grade model that is maintained by Microsoft, and use that then in their application going forwards. So that's a really, really simplistic format that makes integration very, very easy and efficient. So when we arrive at 2023 with the arrival of Azure OpenAI, that's exactly the same format that's been chosen here as well. So we have a very, very simple set of REST APIs. That means that these are very much plug and play applications that can be integrated into existing AI applications or front-end applications or web applications, just by making simple REST API requests. Another point to mention here is that these cognitive services, as powerful as they are, generally speaking, there is one cognitive service that does one thing specifically and very, very well. For example, we have a sentiment analysis endpoint that will analyze text and return a sentiment, either positive or negative, and a score and a confidence score to that effect as well. We then have other APIs such as key phrase extraction, entity recognition, but these are all separate APIs that have very specific inputs and also specific outputs. So if we want to integrate a selection of these services, we're looking at making multiple API calls and then having to parse and treat and work with multiple different response formats. And so whilst they are very, very effective, they do add a little bit of maintenance overhead to these applications. However, when we arrive at things like Azure OpenAI, these are what we call foundation models. And this means that they can actually do many, many different things in the natural language space. So they can do sentiment analysis as well as doing key phrase extraction, entity recognition, and of course, text translation with the same response object and the same response format. So if you're developers that are looking to integrate this into an application, it means there's only one API they need to worry about, one set of authentication, and only one format they need to then parse and return to a user or a calling application. The last thing, a few other things to think about, and this is again, secure by design is just a point I really want to kind of hammer home about the Azure part of the OpenAI integration. It's really important to consider that because this is part of Azure, it's as secure as all your other Azure services are, such as your databases, your Active Directory authentication. These services are secure by design. Of course, your data remains your own data. So data that you use to either plug into that information or data that is being returned remains all part of your own organization and is not used for any retraining of models at all. Something that needs to be thought about, though, is if we're integrating to existing applications, how do we monitor the usage? Can we have a logging system to make sure that we're recording what users are pushing through and getting back from the models to make sure we've got visibility and oversight and make sure that we can live and breathe that responsible AI pledge? And by doing that with monitoring and logging is a really effective way of doing that. Understanding what fine-tuning and plugins might be available. So this is where we can actually start to bring our own data alongside things like ChatGPT. and make sure that it's got the right context and the right awareness of kind of key data assets that might live and breathe inside of your organization. And another just kind of fairly simplistic benefit is that by having this OpenAI service inside of your Azure application, you get consolidated billing, consolidated management overheads, and this just makes things much simpler for integration and overall maintenance of these kind of services. The last thing to talk about is how we kind of monitor and keep on top of these applications. And there's just a few things to kind of consider and think about here. The first thing is, how do we gather user feedback? One of the kind of key differentiators about models and large language models like OpenAI's models are that they are helping to democratize AI. These are not kind of really complex things to understand from a kind of an input-output basis. And so users can really start to get under the skin of these models and understand how they work and really get close to these models quite quickly. So because they're so democratized, it means that we can actually gather user feedback much more effectively. We don't have to just go and speak to data scientists that understand the very deep nuances of what a model's output is trying to tell us. We can really get very close, good feedback by whether a user likes the response they're getting, whether actually it's not appropriate for the question that they asked at all. And of course, we need to be reviewing that user feedback. So if we're implementing and we're adopting an OpenAI application, we need to make sure that the users are aware of firstly, the kind of prompts that they're pushing into that service, but then can we then gather their user feedback on how well they think those prompts are doing, and whether we do need to bring more data to that application, whether we need to fine tune that model a little bit more. So reviewing that input is really important. Keeping up to date. So as probably people may have seen, so we started off with GPT 3.5, which was the ChatGPT model. We've already moved on to GPT-4. And there will be future models to come in time. So keeping up to date and making sure that we are aware of the newer models that may be available and available to us through Azure OpenAI is really important, as the training data will become more effective, but also the capabilities of those models will become much more powerful and give us more abilities, again, all rolled into a single model. An important consideration with any kind of adaptation of any technology is to monitor the costs. How much are we actually spending on that piece of technology? Are we getting the ROI that we expect to see on that piece of technology? And can we review the outputs that model is making? Can we actually see what is being returned to users and making sure that we're happy with those responses and that it's still returning accurate responses? So just to try and explain how some of these models work and just to kind of illustrate how the service actually works, I'm going to now jump into a bit of a OpenAI demo. So I believe I'm going to take the screen share here. Hopefully if someone could just confirm they can see my screen, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Fantastic. Thank you, Faye. So I just want to start the demo by showing what will happen. So as you want to start adopting an Azure OpenAI service, you'll need to make a request to Microsoft to have your use case validated. And once that's done, you'll then have the ability to get into the Azure AI Studio. And this gives you an OpenAI playground, essentially. And it's a fantastic area to start trying out your use case. So going back to my first kind of pillar of adopting use cases, is how do you kind of validate that this use case suits? And in here, you can load examples and you can really start to play around with how these models respond to the various different use cases you might want to play around with. So I suggest having a look at this as soon as you get that use case validated. You can also experiment with the chat as well. So here you can set up your system message, tell your AI assistant how they're going to behave, and you can then start chatting with your AI assistant, again, to validate how that AI assistant is going to behave, the kind of responses they're going to give, and really get to understand how your users are going to perceive your chatbot as and when they get rolled out. I just want to highlight that Microsoft are all about making these tools really simple and easy so that you can get a really effective and clear way of how this is going to work for your users. And you can really build that confidence in these services without having to set up complex demos, large deployments, or have anything too expensive that's going to take up a lot of cost or monitoring. But to kind of move into a bit more of a worked example, I'm going to take you over to a dummy application I built out here just to sort of illustrate some of the common use cases that we see for these kind of models. So kind of to apply a bit of a narrative around this. So for example, if we're working for, say, like a large finance organization, one of the things that we may find we're commonly doing is reviewing contracts, having to pick out individual differences, and then having to kind of summarize those or operate on those or action them in some way, which can take a lot of time for people to review those contracts and understand the implications of certain terms, but also then trying to work out how we negotiate around those and how we then kind of do the back and forth with maybe customers or other businesses that we may be looking to do. So the first thing we want to do is potentially summarize a set of content. So if, for example, we've got our own a set of terms and conditions, we might want to say, I just want a summary of this to save me having to read all individual clauses. Let me just give a summary, and maybe that will allow me to focus individual areas more. So if I take an example, terms and conditions that I've got here, I can copy this out into my web application. I can submit that to my completions endpoint, my Azure OpenAI service. And this will generate a summary of this data for me. As you can see, it takes a second to generate that, but it should be with us any moment now. Okay, and hopefully you can see that we've got a summarized version of the contracts here. This is quite a short summary. We could, for example, say that we want it to be longer or shorter, depending on how we want to interact with the service. But you can see some of the key things that have been pulled out. For example, payments must be made within 15 days of an invoice date. Payments must be made in USD. Any additional services provided by the company will be charged at a daily rate as opposed to hourly or weekly, for example. So there's some key examples of how you can use this summarization to kind of pull out some of the really important parts of that content, which could allow you to navigate your search through here and focus on the key bits that might need refining or might need changing, without having to do a really lengthy read through of a document. On to the next example then. So we may be aware that whilst we have our payment terms, there may be some kind of customer payment terms that we need to look to try and align on to make sure that we can operate closely with a variety of customers. So here we really want to start getting a summary of what are the differences from our payment terms to a customer's payment terms. And if we could highlight those, can we action them, or can we at least, look at how we might negotiate around those? So similar to before, I can take our payment terms and put them into one side of our input, take the customer's payment terms, put those there. So you can see these texts on the face of it look very, very similar, but there are subtle differences which might be difficult to pick out if you're reading through this and it's quite a long document. So if we submit this to our OpenAI service, we should shortly see a response. And you can see here we've got our response down here. So this is listing out individual changes or differences that are between those two contracts. For example, clause 17, deposit payment within 10 days of acceptance, whereas in the version 2, this is due at the time of accepting the quotation. For example, here interest is charged at 1.5% annum, whereas in the customer version, this is charged at 3% per annum. So there are some key differences in here that could have very large business implications, which could easily be missed. So by doing an initial comparison between these two payment terms, we're able to draw out those key differences, and that would allow us to then again go and navigate and focus our time on the key areas of that contract that need revisiting or potentially actioning. So lastly, let's say we've got our payment terms now, and we've kind of identified the differences, but we want to sort of, that's not particularly helpful for us to then start the negotiation process with that particular customer. So instead, let's see if we can get the OpenAI service to generate an email that summarizes those particular differences. We want to make sure it's formal in nature as it's going to a particular customer. We may want to indicate that we're open to negotiation on some points, but not others. So we can get this to actually generate for us quite a nice looking email straight off the bat, which means that we kind of are saving our time, and we could almost start to automate the process of this comparison and then flagging of these differences. So here you can see it's generated for us a subject, and we have quite a nice formal, nicely worded email that summarizes those differences and confirms that we're open to negotiating should that be appropriate. So hopefully that's kind of shown off how we can use some of the more basic functionality behind Azure OpenAI, such as summarizing content. We can also use it to do really, really effective things that help to us be much more efficient as an organization, such as document comparison and drawing out some key differences. And also use that generation functionality to be able to start generating things like emails, or or start to blend these two terms together and generate a content that might represent that, to be really, really effective and help to drive through those efficiencies within our organization. So I will now stop sharing my screen, and I believe Faye will take back the share. Thank you very much. So the last thing I want to kind of touch on here really is that we have sort of a few of the offerings that can really help you get started when working with these Azure OpenAI services. And the first thing I want to talk about is our Adatis OpenAI Envisioning Workshop. This is a really powerful way of us getting under the skin of some of the different use cases that an organization might have, and really helping to drive out what priority those use cases should be attempted to be tackled in, and also focus on how we balance off the impact versus the simplicity to implement using something like a Boston grid, which you can see in the image there below. This is generally taken as a full or half-day workshop where we look to take a cross-section of an organization. So that's from sort of business stakeholders or business leaders all the way through to subject matter experts and kind of data back-end experts as well, to understand how the challenges or the opportunities that might live within a business can really be fleshed out and tackled using services like Azure OpenAI. For those organizations that are slightly more mature and already have some fleshed out and agreed use cases, we can actually look at doing something more tangible using the Azure OpenAI enablement. And this particular proposition looks at the particular use cases you might have within your organization, but then looks to stand up solutions and tangible outputs that can then be either taken onto a production setting or can serve the basis of more thorough analysis and use case review, so that we can build out that roadmap for future enhancements and really validate the efficiency of those use cases. And the last thing I want to say is that as a close partner to Microsoft, we have a number of benefits, such as doing webinars like this with folks like Deb, which is obviously fantastic. We're also part of the Microsoft Azure AI Accelerator program, which means we have really close links to Microsoft, in particular on the OpenAI side of things, and can really look to capitalize those opportunities with the help and support from Microsoft to make sure we get the absolute best out of those particular opportunities. And whether that's to do with OpenAI or just data and analytics in general, Adatis are a really strong partner with that relationship to Microsoft to help you achieve those goals. So as we close up, I just want to say a big thank you to Deb for her time on this webinar and for giving us that Microsoft lens on Azure OpenAI and where that's going in future. And I think we can now open up to questions from the floor.
Yeah, just to echo that, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Deb. It was a really, really great session. So yeah, if everybody has any questions, you can add them to the Q&A or chat function. Well, we'll wait a couple of minutes just to see if we get any through. We would really appreciate it if you could provide us a bit of feedback on the session for today. So you can see there's a QR code that you can scan to access our survey, and there'll also be an email that's sent out at the end of the session. Oh, Chris, the QI function looks disabled. Oh, okay. Well, you can just add a question to the chat function if you do have any. Thanks for that, Chris. Yep, the session will be recorded, so I will share that out after we finish up today. Okay, we've got a few coming through now. So from Jennifer, if we wanted to embed OpenAI in our Office 365 tenancy, what licensing would we need? We have E5 but are not really using Azure yet. Who would like to take that?
Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So Azure OpenAI is an Azure service. So it isn't a license like you would buy Office 365. It's literally how much of that service you would be consuming. So say if you started very small, then you literally just pay as you go for however many minutes, however many hours that you would use that Azure OpenAI service for. When will the Azure OpenAI service come into the UK data centre? We're still waiting on dates at the moment. What we have found, though, to Matt's point, we have a lot of customers that are actually using the API service in one of the European regions, and they're not moving their data. They're keeping their data in the UK DC. They're just literally calling the API, so it's not causing them any issues. We are still pushing to get it into the UK, but I'm sure all of you are aware the the GPUs needed, Nvidia's share price went through the roof. We're still trying to obviously get all that capacity into the UK.
Thanks, Debs. Number one, any news on generative AI and Power BI?
Power BI will have a co-pilot. It has been announced. We're just waiting again to see when that's going to land. So yeah, Power BI will have co-pilot embedded.
Perfect. And then a question from Chris. Could you speak a little to any GDPR concerns that people may have?
Matt, anything from you there? I must admit, nobody has asked me specifically about GDPR. I don't know if they've asked you.
Yeah, I mean, there's been nothing specific. I mean, I think it's obviously important, as I say in that sort of use case review, to kind of bear in mind what data is going to be coming through, and you know, what kind of outputs might your models be generating versus the input. So if these might have kind of PII information in them, then obviously there's that to bear in mind. And I think at that point, all the other GDPR, you know, regulations apply really. I think it's about, you know, keeping the fact that this is just that, you know, at the end of the day, this is an AI application. So you would treat it the same as you would with any other AI application and treat that data responsibly. You know, depending on how much PII information or sensitive information is being used in the source.
Great. From Ruben, do we know what might be new in ChatGPT 4.5, 5x, etc.?
I mean, I think, Deb, I'll maybe come back to you on this and let you come in as well. I mean, I think the thing that we see is that more and more of the kind of features that maybe in, you know, for example, in DALL-E 2, for example, may start to roll into more of one model. So, you know, GPT-5 could maybe combine various different aspects of, you know, image data or audio data, for example. So rather than having kind of text-based models, image-based models, and audio-based models, we start to roll that all into one model that has the power to do all those different things. So making those kind of foundational models a bit more kind of pervasive, I think, is the key thing.
So I've just seen the one from David about fine-tuning the Azure OpenAI to your particular subject matter and rules. That's exactly what Azure OpenAI is there for, because it's living in your subscription. You then actually pull in your own data so that you can train it on your own data, and you can give it its own prompts. So those are the rules, and all of the different say tram lines, I suppose, or things that you don't want it to do, or sensitivities to have to Matt's point when he was doing the demo and showing on the slides. So yes, that's exactly what Azure OpenAI is there for. It's not supposed to be a generic thing. It's supposed to be the tool in the kit box for you to use and then actually modify and train to do what you want it to do specifically for your business. Okay, there's another one here mentioning Fabric. So any plan to shift or recommend the new Microsoft Fabric? I don't have any plan to shift or recommend over any other service. We have, I suppose, lots of different services for similar jobs. We have Azure Databricks, we have Synapse, we have Fabric. The whole idea of Fabric that was introduced is it's a lakehouse architecture. It's the same as Databricks. It's something that will be made available goes generally available towards the end of the year, but it's not a replace or rip out and replace anything else. It's just an evolution. You add value where you see that there is value to be added against your existing implementations.
There's one here that I'd like to pick up on. So I think Alex asked a question about how deterministic the outputs can be. So there are parameters that you can use to tune how deterministic those outputs will be. In particular, there's a parameter called temperature. So if you increase the temperature as you feed your API, that introduces more and more randomness into the outputs that are generated by the model. And conversely, if you reduce that all the way down to 0, whilst you don't guarantee a deterministic response, you're essentially really limiting the randomness that the model will use when generating its predicted outputs. So there are different parameters you can tune to attempt to make your responses much more deterministic. There's a question here around the submitting use cases for AI Studio.
Yeah, so as far as I was aware, submitting use cases for any of the Azure OpenAI is a standard process. It should just be through the website. So unless somebody wants to tell me it's very different for AI Studio. AI Studio was only announced at Build 2 weeks ago, but you should just be able to submit for access on the use cases in exactly the same way as all the OpenAI services. Again, there's a question here, Matt, about costings. I'm pretty sure it's publicly, I'll check the portal now, but it's the same as every other service.
There's quite a lot of information out there. I mean, one thing that is quite useful is it is all available on the Azure pricing calculator. So if you head over to the pricing calculator, you can put in the Azure OpenAI service, choose kind of what types of model you're after. The kind of the key metric for sizing your price is based on tokens. So tokens are not quite the same as words, but there's a kind of I think it's about, roughly speaking, 4 words as a token or so. So you can kind of use that to sort of generalize how many tokens you might be using in a given time period, and that should help to give you an estimate of cost.
I was just trying to grab the link, but it's coming in. Here we go. I've just popped it into the chat, the pricing calculator.
Thanks, Deb.
Great. So there's quite a few other questions, but I know we're kind of coming to the end of the session. So what we could do is we could try take these offline and answer them after the session, if that's all okay for those that are waiting. But yeah, no, thank you, Deb and Matt, for your time today. It's been, yeah, really valuable, obviously sparked lots of interest, and we've been great attendance as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. So recording will be shared later on this afternoon, and if you do think of any other questions that weren't able to be answered, then we can pick that up offline as well. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.